Hey, how's it going, everybody? I am Indypride from Milk and Cookies Total War with another Warhammer lore, army, and tactics video. This time we're covering the Dark Elves of Naggaroth, a warlike and sadistic people known for their penchant for torture and for their bitter, millennia-long civil war with the High Elves of Ulthuan. This video will cover Dark Elf lore, their army compositions and tactics, and how they might translate into Total War Warhammer. So as usual, the questions I'll be looking to answer include: who are the Dark Elves? Where do they come from? Why are they important in the Warhammer world? And what characterizes them as a faction? As with my previous lore, army, and tactics videos, which include the Wood Elves, Tomb Kings, and Lizardmen, I'll be using the 8th edition army books to fill the bulk of this faction's lore, and then we'll talk about cool gameplay mechanics Creative Assembly could implement based off that, and of course discuss possible Legendary Lord choices as well. I'll cover this in more detail later in the video, but retroactive continuity, or retconning for short, has affected Dark Elf lore more than many of the other races in Warhammer Fantasy, so I'll try my best to sort out some of those discrepancies, but there's no question some of their previous edition lore will bleed into this video as well. We can start with a quick and dirty overview of the Druchii and then jump into their very extensive story arc. I will say right now, there's a bit of debate about the correct pronunciation in Drew here, which is their native language. I've seen threads stretching back more than a decade where people are arguing about how it's pronounced. Druchii is fine, I think, but I'll be sticking with the Druchii because it's what I'm used to. It's a pretty common way of saying it, and I haven't seen a factual conclusion for one or the other. So the Dark Elves, or the Druchii as they are known in their native dialect, are the outcast children of Ulthuan, an arrogant, scheming, and ruthlessly intelligent race of elves. They watch the world with malevolent eyes, believing the world is their birthright, and the other races that inhabit it merely their playthings. They are the dark, sinister cousins, the second half of a race sundered long ago, separated by the greatest betrayal in the history of this world. While the High Elves live, there will be no peace and no rest, not until their temples have fallen, their streets run red with torrents of blood, and their people driven into the sea. And as you will quickly come to realize, they are a very edgy, very angsty culture that holds a grudge almost as well as the Dawi themselves. Their entire culture is based on slaves, sex, sacking, sacrifice, and scheming, and a healthy dose of utterly brutal torture that would make Hannibal Lecter squeamish. Politics and family life are characterized by frequent assassinations, fratricide, and an utter disregard for human standards of morality. But at this point, it shouldn't really come as a surprise to you that's par for the course in the wonderful world of Warhammer. As is common with all three races of elves, the Druchii are blindingly fast and agile, putting to shame even the most elegant and graceful of the other races that inhabit the world, but they are also somewhat fragile. This means that Dark Elf generals can't brute force engagements with their armies in the manner that a Chaos Lord or an Ogre Tyrant would, and instead rely on actual tactics and strategy. And as a result, Druchii commanders are considered among the finest in the world, with a wide array of deadly tools to choose from the elite shot cavalry of the Cold One Knights, armored elves riding gigantic raptors into battle, to the unarmored but wicked warrior priestesses of the Cult of Khaine, to the monstrous Charybdis and famed Hydras of Naggaroth. So now that you all have a very basic overview of the Dark Elves, let's talk about their story, which begins with the Doomtide of Chaos. If you remember from the beginning of my Lizardmen lore, army, and tactics video, the great Stargate of the Old Ones, the beings responsible for the creation and guidance of the races of the Warhammer world, collapsed in on itself, ripping a hole in the fabric of reality and creating a portal to the warp. Through this portal spilled the forces of chaos, an unstoppable wave of demons who threatened to consume the world, slaughtering untold numbers of innocents and corrupting the land wherever their armies marched. The elves at this point were a very young race, single and unified in purpose, living on the continent of Ulthuan, and when the demons arrived, they appeared defenseless against this surprise onslaught, untouched at this point by war that would ravage the world for the coming millennia. Yet from the blood and slaughter emerged the greatest elf hero to ever walk the earth, Anarion the Defender. It was Anarion who would rally the elves and teach them the ways of war, and kindle within them a fire and passion for battle. In the long history of the elven race, no warrior surpassed his martial skill or ability to lead. But the war against the demons was unwinnable. No matter how many countless victories, no matter how many greater demons were cast back into the abyss, they were an unending tide, and the elves were bleeding at a rate they could ill afford. So in desperation, Anarion went to the sacred fire of Azurian the Creator, lord of all the elven gods, and offered himself as the ultimate sacrifice. Through sheer strength of will and purity of heart, he survived the flames, and emerged an even greater hero, purified of his own imperfections, and instilling in his people a fierce courage that radiated like the sun, and caused demons to cower in his presence. Ever afterwards, he was hailed as the Phoenix King, the reborn son of Azurian, and the champion of the elven race. The people flocked to Anarion's army, and the tide began to turn. It was at this time that Anarion met with the first of the dragon tamers, the powerful mage Calidor, and with the aid of his dragon riders, Calidor had also pushed back the first invasion of the demons from his own lands, and the two saw the strength that existed in each other, and they realized that they shared a common purpose. Calidor recognized the sacred blessing bestowed upon Anarion by the flames of their creator, and swore fealty to the Phoenix King, adding the strength of his armies to a burgeoning elven force. For decades they fought together, and with the elves' natural grace, steeled with the discipline of their king, the armies of Ulthuan grew in power year by year. As magic swirled through the world, Calidor set the priest of the smith god Vol to bind these energies into weapons, with which to fight the demons. So the elven army was growing in strength, but with all that said, the legions of chaos demons were still coming. There were literally millions of them pouring through the warp rift, and the mage lord Calidor saw that there would be no ultimate victory by war alone. Calidor devised a bold plan to rid the world of chaos forever. The dragon tamer and his mages would create a magical vortex to siphon away the power of the demons and return it to the realm of chaos. Anarion cursed Calidor as a fool, for the magic and weapons the elves used against the demons drew heavily upon the energies of chaos pouring from the north, and frankly he believed there was no hope that such a plan could succeed. He felt like what Calidor's plan was doing was stripping the elves of their only tool to deal with the chaos demons. He was wrong, of course. Anarion was intelligent and one of the greatest warriors in the history of Warhammer, but he was a hothead, and despite Calidor's calm and reasoned explanation, he would not be swayed. And around this time, tragedy struck. Astariel, the ever-queen of the elves and Anarion's wife, had retreated deep into the forests of Avalorn with her two children, Morelian and Yvraine, to spare them from the horrors of war. The demons were very wary of attacking Avalorn because they sensed that the tree spirits who dwelled there were not so dissimilar from themselves, and they felt that the elves were easier prey than the savage treekin of the forest. Now remember that Avalorn was one of the sites connected by the world routes to the Oak of Ages in Athel Loren, and as such, the ancient tree spirits like Adanhu, Coetel, and most importantly Durthu, who we covered in the Wood Elves lore video, could travel to and from Ulthuan on a whim. Durthu in particular had forged a very strong bond with the elves, and so when the demons finally grew some testicles and decided to attack Avalorn, he was ready. Instead of retreating to Athel Loren half the world away, he stood with his friends, ripping apart the chaotic freaks and cutting them down in droves. But Avalorn burned, and Astariel knew she had no time, so she asked a favor of the Ancient. She requested that Morelian and Yvraine be spirited away to the Oak of Ages, and saved from the eternal torment at the hands of Nakari, the feared Keeper of Secrets, and Slanesh, his Dark Prince. Durthu was hesitant, because he knew the other tree spirits would consider carrying blooded creatures through the world routes a dire transgression, but he relented, warning Astariel that the elves would have to pay a hefty price in the distant future. Left with no other choice, she accepted, saving her children and plunging headlong into combat with Nakari, despoiler of bodies and devourer of spirits, whose cruel embrace brought not death, but oblivion of the soul. When Anarion heard of his wife's death, and without knowing where his children were, he flew into a rage, traveling to the Blighted Isle and entering the Shrine of Khaine, the elves' bloody god of murder. Within the black altar stood the weapon of the Lord of Murder, the Widowmaker, the Sword of Khaine, a godslayer of immense power. It was an accursed weapon, and the moment Anarion drew it from the altar, he invited Khaine into his heart and his soul, dooming both himself and his line for all time. This curse was twofold. First, the entire elven race was cursed to be divided by Khaine. In the instant the sword came free, the bloody-handed god claimed half of all of Isha's children for himself, infecting them with a deep sense of bloodlust that played a crucial role in the civil war that was to come. Remember that Isha is the mother of the elven race. The second part of the curse was the curse on Anarion's line. All who possessed his blood were also cursed by Khaine to be given great power at great personal cost. In Teclis, the High Elf Archmage who would come later in the story, this manifested itself physically, making his body weak, but granting him the power to become one of the greatest spellcasters in Warhammer fantasy history. In Tyrion, his twin brother, the prince was given incredible physical gifts and combat ability, but left him with an ugly, inconsolable rage deep down that eventually caused him to draw the Widowmaker, becoming the avatar of Khaine. But armed with a god's weapon and riding the great dragon in Dragnir, he beat the ever-living crap out of some demon hordes, kicking their collective asses off his home continent. And it was at this point he began to champion the cause of the elves who had suffered the most during the war, for their sorrow reflected his own. He founded a new kingdom in bleak Naggaroth, where the elves began to exhibit ever more warlike and barbaric tendencies, which was honestly very logical, considering the gigantic losses they had sustained from the demons' incursion. Anarion took another wife, Morathi, a seeress who he had rescued from a Slaaneshi host, and who was widely considered one of the most beautiful beings in Warhammer fantasy. What Anarion did not know was that she would also grow to become one of the most powerful mages in existence, and a malevolent force so evil her tendrils would spread and corrupt throughout the world. We'll talk about that a little bit later. She sank her claws into Anarion, and although she dearly loved him, she also manipulated the crap out of him and his grief, becoming ever more influential and earning the adoration of her people. She also gave Anarion a son and heir named Malekith, who thrived under their tutelage, becoming an accomplished warrior, a skilled mage, and a leader of great quality. But Kallador Dragontamer saw the people of Naggaroth slipping into hedonism, excess, and bloodsport, and he was utterly disgusted by Morathi, so he jumped ship, leaving the kingdom to found his own in the south of Ulthuan. Anarion was understandably pissed. Kallador was his greatest friend, and he believed this to be a gigantic betrayal. Civil war between Naggaroth and Kallador loomed darkly on the horizon, until the day the demons came again, in a tide that far eclipsed all previous assaults. While Anarion attacked and stalled their advance, Kallador resolved to enact his plan for the magical vortex that would drain the world of its chaotic energy. And though he battled as hard as he did before, this time the defender could not break the demonic horde. When Kallador and his mages began their complex ritual to disperse the magic of the demons, Anarion had no choice but to rally to their aid. He surrounded the chanting mages with his army as demons of all the chaos gods assailed them from every side. In the climactic battle, Anarion himself slew 4 greater demons of chaos with the help of Dragnir. Battered and bloody, Anarion fought on as the incantations of the mages grew in power. And finally, when all hope seemed lost, the vortex of Kallador sprang into life. A whirling, screaming tempest of magic engulfed Ulthuan, slaying thousands and tearing down towers and castles. Trapped within the eye of the vortex stood Kallador and his mages, frozen in a battle against the forces they sought to contain for all time. And with his final strength, Anarion flew atop Dragnir to the shrine of Khaine. He returned his sword to the Black Altar, and there breathed his last. The first and greatest of the Phoenix Kings was dead, lying atop the corpse of his loyal dragon. Ulthuan was in ruins, but the vortex had been successful, banishing millions of demons to the warp and weakening their hold on the material plane for all eternity. Or so they thought. The elves thanked the gods and praised Anarion, and set about creating a realm of light and warmth to drive away the evils that had beset them for millennia. But first, they needed a new king. The natural successor, many believed, was Malekith, who had any number of fantastic qualities, but his detractors stated that he came from Naggaroth, which was a realm looked on with suspicion by the other kingdoms of Ulthuan. The princes ultimately raised Bel-Shanar, Prince of Tiranoc, to the Phoenix Throne, which severely pissed off Morathi, as you would expect, and she acted like one of those nightmare moms on the sideline at a kid's soccer game, the ones who have way too much to drink and scream insults at 5-year-olds. But despite this, Malekith bent the knee, traveling the world and relieving monsters of their heads the world over. He earned such a reputation for his martial prowess and generalship, he was appointed as ambassador to the High King of the Dwarfs, Snorri Whitebeard, who we know now as Grombrindal, the White Dwarf. He traveled to the Blighted Isles and stood before the altar of Khaine. He fought the Greenskins in the Old World, and he even traveled to the Chaos Wastes. And it was there, in the frozen north, that he came upon a city of the dead. He wandered through the icy labyrinth between gigantic structures that should have been impossible. The shifting ice had ruptured an ancient vault, and within it, Malekith found an artifact older than the elves themselves. It was a metal crown imbued with powers of sorcery, now known in myth as the Circlet of Iron. Malekith took it and resolved to unravel its secrets. It awoke in him a dark curiosity, and from that day forth, Malekith turned his will to studying the forbidden depths of magic. So while Malekith explored the wider world, new travails beset Ulthuan in his absence. With the threat of the demons gone, many of the lessons of hard war were forgotten. Many elves became indolent and selfish, indulging in their heightened senses with ceremonies dedicated to exotic, forbidden gods. From the ancient temples of Naggaroth they had risen, cults of luxury, pleasure, and excess that grew within the cities and spread across the kingdoms. These cults practiced obscene rituals of debasement and sacrifice, and more followers were drawn to dark shrines dedicated to gods that shouldn't have been worshipped. Belshazzar seemed powerless to quell this growing unrest in his realm. The pleasure cults were gaining more and more sway with every passing season, and the worst affected realm was Naggaroth. But the Phoenix King was hesitant to act against the lands of Anarion's people. Princes caught in the grip of the cults began to mutter that Belshazzar was weak and a usurper of the Phoenix Throne. And then Malekith returned to a kingdom in utter turmoil. These pleasure cults were a serious issue. They were destabilizing the kingdoms, creating friction between the Phoenix King and Naggaroth in particular, and threatened to bring about a civil war that had the potential to divide many powerful houses from within and send the entire continent spiraling into civil war. In previous editions of Warhammer Fantasy, these cults were secret Slaanesh worshippers, elves who fell to the lure of chaos and frequently had big, steaming orgies dedicated to the Dark Prince. This has since been retconned so that the cults of pleasure worship Authority of the Sithari, goddess of pleasure and indulgence. The difference may seem minor because both Authority and Slaanesh desire orgies and overindulgence and ever more perverted sensation, but Authority is an elven goddess like Khaine, and as such is officially sanctioned worship, while worship of Slaanesh could undermine the Witch King's rule and was therefore banned. As we know, the Chaos Gods seek absolute devotion, so you can see the conflict of interest there between the Phoenix King, or Malekith in this case, and the Chaos Gods, and devotion to them. But Malekith vowed to hunt down these pleasure cults and exterminate them, claiming that no kingdom would be beyond his wrath, not even Naggaroth. When Malekith discovered that his mother was one of the chief architects of the cults, he publicly renounced her and ordered that she be imprisoned. He quelled rebellion across Ulthuan and ingratiated himself to Belshazzar, the Phoenix King. But what no one realized was that both Morathi and Malekith were ever plotting, waiting for the opportunity to depose the Phoenix King and step into the flames of Azurion. So Anarion's son asked Belshazzar to convene the Council of Princes, under the guise of uniting the armies to eradicate these cults for good. And it was at this point that Morathi and Malekith made their bid for the throne. Unbeknownst to the other kingdoms, Naggaroth's armies marched, bolstered by the same cultists and practitioners of dark magic that Malekith had sworn to destroy. Oblivious to the peril that descended upon their lands, the princes gathered to hear him. His first pronouncement was to declare Belshazzar a member of the cults. Malekith said that the Phoenix King had taken the coward's route rather than be brought forth before the princes, and had poisoned himself before he could be rightfully tried. With Ulthuan on the verge of civil war again, Malekith would assume his rightful position as Phoenix King and avert the coming disaster. But many of the princes were not swayed by Malekith's speech, and denounced him as a murderer and a traitor. They had known Belshazzar for centuries, and knew he did not have the capacity for excess the cults were growing famous for. And they were right. Malekith had forced the Phoenix King to drink raw poison. But it didn't matter. Cultists from Naggaroth broke into the shrine and began murdering the princes, as he strode into the flames to accept Azurian's blessing and assume the mantle of Phoenix King. But as Malekith walked into the flames, he was not rewarded with purity and strength of purpose. His screams echoed around the chamber as the flames engulfed him, stripping away his hair, his skin, and his flesh. And he burned. And with a final shriek of agony, he fell away from the burning judgment of Azurian, charred to the very bone. But Malekith's story was just beginning. Civil war erupted, and through sheer strength of will and refusal to succumb to his injuries, he somehow survived. Which was basically impossible. I can't really overstate that. Walking through Azurian the Creator's flame isn't something any badass can do. You must be chosen to walk through, worthy of that mantle, and if you're not, you will burn and you will die. It isn't just a flame that gives you third-degree burns, it pierces your soul, your very life essence. So not only was Malekith's body horribly disfigured, he was driven insane, and his soul was immolated. And off pure rage and not succeeding where his father had, he willed himself to stay alive, which was an incredibly impressive feat in and of itself. Marathi, for her part, ran to her son's side, commissioning a renegade priest of Vol, the Smith God, to create the Armor of Midnight, rune-forged armor of a fallen meteor that was fused directly to his still-burning skin. The armor was terrifying to look upon, and ever after, he would be known as the Witch King. With him, the armies of Naggaroth marched to war, cutting off the inner kingdoms of Ulthuan from the outer kingdoms via the mountain passes, and taking control of the continent. But despite having the most powerful armies and most warlike people in all of Ulthuan, they could not completely control every kingdom within Ulthuan. The mages of Safari, the charioteers of Tiranoc, the white lions of Trace, and the dragons of Kalador rallied together under the new Phoenix King Imric of Kalador. Imric was a fantastic general and would take the blessed name Kalador the Conqueror in memory of his grandfather Kalador Dragontamer, the mage who created the Great Vortex. Malekith and Kalador I waged war for the heart and soul of their home continent. For 25 years, neither could gain the victory they needed. Then, at the fields of Malador, the Witch King and his forces had their chance. Vastly outnumbering the forces of Kalador, they began an all-out assault to finish the war in one decisive blow. The Witch King on his terrifying black dragon Sulek rained lightning and titanic dark energies at the High Elves, and almost broke them, until Kalador met her with a spear through her gaping mouth, piercing the dragon's brain and killing Sulek instantly. Malekith fell into the ranks of Phoenix Guard protecting their king, and successfully cut his way out, but the battle went to the High Elves. And then Malekith decided on a course of action from which there could be no return. He and his sorcerers would unbind the magic of the Ulthuan vortex created by Kalador Dragontamer, unleashing the full fury of the realm of chaos upon the island. The Witch King would summon the demon hordes to fight at his side and sweep away all opposition. Knowing that their fate was tied to that of the Witch King, the sorcerers agreed to this insane gambit. Malekith and his followers were willing to risk everything for victory, even the future of the whole world. To their minds, failure was incomprehensible. To live in exile and obscurity was unthinkable for the Witch King. He would rather the world ended than see it ruled by any other. Only one of his disciples saw the madness of Malekith's ploy and escaped Naggaroth to bring word to Kalador. Successfully unbinding the vortex would have ended the world then and there, condemning it to the forces of chaos. So Kalador instantly recognized the gravity of the situation. Gathering his own mages, a mystical fight for control of the vortex and fate of the world began, and the sundering of Ulthuan was set in motion. Dark and light magic swirled and screamed for days, and finally, just as the vortex began failing and the Dark Elf mages believed they had won, the magical backlash freed Kalador Dragontamer and the original casters from their stasis, in which they had been frozen for centuries, returning them to the realm of the living for but a brief moment. Lending their own energy, the High Elves prevailed, dragging the vortex back into place. But the forces at play here were phenomenal. We're talking about every single Dark Elf and High Elf mage all vying for control over a single object, and using all of their magical prowess to do it. The backlash was titanic, tearing Ulthuan apart as a tidal wave thousands of feet high engulfed Naggaroth and Tiranoc. Entire cities were drowned and smashed in an instant, and tens of thousands of elves perished. The sound of Ulthuan cracking could be heard in the World's Edge Mountains thousands of miles away. As the deluge swept down from the realm of Malekith, his followers used the last of their sorcerous power to hold back the storm. Energized with chaos magic, their dark citadels broke free from their rocky foundations and rose upon the frothing waves. Malekith's plan had failed, and his energy was spent. His kingdom lay beneath the waves, and his army was all but destroyed. Upon the floating castles of Lost Naggaroth, the Black Arks, the Witch King and his minions fled the wrath of the cataclysm that had almost consumed the world. Across the frozen seas they traveled to the desolate wilderness of Naggaroth, the land of Chill, the equivalent of North America on the Warhammer map. So, at this point, I need to mention a couple of things. As we know, since the great coming of chaos, the elves have been taking tremendous loss after tremendous loss in battle. There have been brief moments of tenuous peace, but for the most part, it's been unending war for millennia. By the time the Dark Elves, but especially the High Elves, make it into present day, roughly the year 2502 of the Imperial calendar, both are considered to be in decline, which is to be expected, right? No matter how strong your military or economy, if your citizens take decades to reach sexual maturity, and sometimes centuries before they find someone to breed with, replenishing your losses from battle becomes quite challenging when compared to a faction like Vermin, like the Skaven, who have essentially an unlimited population supply to draw from. How is it, then, that the elves are able to sustain these mind-numbing losses in battle after battle, disaster after disaster, and keep going? Well, the answer may not be very satisfying. The straight answer is, population statistics in Warhammer Fantasy are very intentionally left vague for this very reason. I believe it was Gav Thorpe, a writer for numerous fantasy and 40k novels, who said that losing 10,000 elves in a single battle could be a statistic, and losing 10 could be an utter tragedy, but either way, they will still be in decline when they come out on the other side. In essence, there are always just enough elves for the purposes of the story, so if a Slaaneshi horde needs to threaten Naggaroth for a story arc, losing tens of thousands of Dark Elves in the war is not out of the question. But with that said, it's been theorized that the Dark Elves replenish their losses much more quickly than the High Elves do, in large part due to their worship of authority, and the fact that they're banging each other's brains out on just about every occasion they can think of. Not that the High Elves aren't also promiscuous, as it is actually very common in Azure culture to take a consort outside of marriage, but the Dark Elves, as they do with most things, take it many steps further. Also, we should talk about the Sundering a bit more. So obviously we just covered this part of the story where the Dark Elves and High Elves have literally split their home continent, with the Druchii taking off in their Black Arks towards the coast of Naggaroth, where they will create a new home for themselves. The Sundering, hands down, is one of the most important events in the history of Warhammer Fantasy. It has vast implications, not just for the elves, but for the entire world. Instead of potentially trying to re-assimilate some of the more warlike and worthy Azure from Malekith's perspective, should his war for Ulthuan have proved successful, Malekith almost unleashed the Great Vortex when he was foiled, which would have undoubtedly doomed the world then and there. From that point on, he bent his considerable will and malice towards the High Elves' complete destruction. The creation of the Black Arks would not have happened without the Sundering, and the Druchii would have likely been a significantly less powerful naval force without them. In addition, Anhara Draconis, home to the Starwood trees and the forest responsible for supplying the High Elves with material to create their famed dragon ships, was lost during the Sundering. This meant that no more dragon ships, which are considered the finest naval vessels in Warhammer history, could ever be created again. So while the Sundering may have bolstered Druchii naval capabilities in the long run, it was undoubtedly a severe blow to the Azure and their naval prowess. It was at Clark-Arond, one of the 6 major Dark Elf cities that will soon be built, the greatest Dark Elf port was founded, blossoming into a center for the slave trade economy their culture was built on. But without such a strong navy that came about as a result of the Sundering, The remnants of Naggaroth would have had a difficult time maintaining that slave trade, which of course affected dwarfs, humans, and elves the world over for thousands of years, and might have ultimately led to a collapse of the Dark Elf civilization without a labor force or slave economy to support it. So yes, the Sundering was an extremely important event, but let's talk about what happened when Malekith and his people came to the Land of Chill. So after a long and icy ride across the Sea of Malus, the Black Ark that had once been Malekith's castle landed on Naggaroth. Hunting parties were gathered and prey was plentiful, but it was a bitterly cold land. More dangerous than the perils of frostbite and starvation, though, were the many vicious predators that stalked the land. The dark forest to the south and east, and the forbidding mountains to the west, held many fell beasts, and hundreds of dark elves were devoured in the night as they made camp. Cold ones, known as the Noglir and Druhir, were gigantic raptor-like beasts with a savage nature, and the elves quickly learned how to tame them with meat. They were nearly impervious to pain, exuding a pain-killing toxin many times more potent than Novocaine, and could rip a horse in half. These, along with the hydras in the mountains, were captured and began to form a core of fearsome monstrous regiments, with beast mastery becoming a quickly sought-after skill. Scouts quickly found rich loads of minerals in the mountains, but Malekith's people had no aptitude for mining and smelting, nor for building the walls that would be needed to keep away the mutant beasts, nor for farming or animal husbandry. In fact, they weren't really good for much anything except war and slavery, so they went back to what they knew best. They were warriors and had known almost nothing but war against the demons, against the orcs, against the beastmen, and lastly against their fellow elves, and Malekith soon realized that although he still had a formidable fighting force, his people cared nothing for the building of a new civilization. If the Druchii were to build a new kingdom in the west, they would need a workforce to build it for them, and so began the bloodthirsty raids of the Dark Elves. At first, their attacks were directed solely against their kin in Ulthuan, to take food and other supplies. The High Elves for the most part would fight to the death rather than be taken in battle, and so Malekith's labor force did not grow quickly because the High Elves wouldn't let themselves get captured. Then word arrived from ships that had traveled further east to the forests and mountains of the colonies where Malekith had once fought alongside the dwarfs. Primitive humans lived there, in caves and mud huts, the ancestors of those tribes who would come to form the Empire of Man in Bretonnia. They were brutal, and they were stupid, but the Dark Elves didn't really care, for humans also bred quickly and were physically strong. Knowing that these short-lived savages could be easily controlled and swiftly grew in number, Malekith dispatched many fleets over the coming decades to steal away entire settlements of humans and bring them back to Naggaroth, and thus was a slave economy born. Though they understood little of what their lords asked of them, the humans learned well enough from the whips of their masters how to dig ore from rock, herd cattle, and forage in the woods. Guided by captured elven masons and carpenters, the slaves began to build a city around Malekith's citadel. He named this place Naggarond, the City of Winter, and its dark spires started to tower higher and higher over the growing pirate port that nestled in its black shadow. But Naggarond was but one of 6 major cities to be built in Naggaroth. In Grond, the North Tower, Morathi would found the Convent of Sorceresses, where gifted oracles and witches tested themselves against their queen's cunning mental traps, learning to manipulate the wind of Dar, or dark magic. Unlike high magic, Dar is a reckless, direct, and immediate form of spellcraft based on willpower. Where high magic is the harmony of all 8 winds harnessed together, working in unison, dark magic are the same winds in chaos and discord, wild and unpredictable. But of course, Morathi was the most skilled practitioner of Dar in all the known world, and could corrupt and deceive and end life with the slightest thought. She taught her convent well, and those who did not learn quickly perished. Karan Nakar, as I already mentioned, became the Tower of Despair, the largest slave port with access to a vast underground sea that let corsairs avoid the wild and frosty seas of Chill and Malus. This made Karan Kar incredibly important, because all returning ships from raids had to pass through this port, paying a hefty toll to continue on with their goods, and it provided much of the naval power that Malekith used to keep his kingdom running smoothly. Harganeth became the city of executioners, and the religious capital of the Cult of Khaine, which had risen to absolute prominence as the dominant religion of Naggaroth. Once a year, the witch elves descend from the temples of Khaine into the narrow city streets, while manic drumming and shrill pipes echo through thick clouds of blood-red smoke. This is Death Night, the holiest time of the year, and a time of terror for all in the land of Chill. Through the smoke prowl the brides of Khaine, who will sacrifice any dark elf they happen across. This event is sanctioned by Malekith, as Khaine must be appeased by the blood of his own followers and his enemies. And it is on Death Night, reinvigorated by the blood of the slain, that the hag queens of each major city are at their most beautiful, filled with vitality. Over the course of the year, they slowly revert to their true, haggard, and ancient appearance, but for that one night, they are avatars of lustful slaughter, true daughters of Khaine. Now the Cult of Khaine is led by Helebron, the Blood Queen of Harganneth, a crone of immense age who has a famous rivalry with Morathi. The thing about Morathi is that although she is an evil and capricious witch, beyond any doubt, she is eternally youthful. Having the deepest knowledge of the blood rituals in Khaine's cauldrons has kept her rejuvenated and sexy as hell, despite being one of the oldest known beings in Warhammer. Morathi obviously had no desire to teach Helebron her secrets, so over the millennia, Helebron has withered, each year requiring more and more sacrifice to appear youthful for shorter and shorter spurts. She spends much of the year hooded and cloaked, and it is only on the days following Death Night that she can stride forth with the youth she once had. With that said, she is the greatest bride of Khaine in their long history, with a penchant for murder rivaled not even by Morathi. She commands an insane amount of respect, and her pupils wear masks around her to hide their beauty, lest they trigger her jealousy and her wrath. Helebron and Morathi absolutely despise each other, and have plotted ways to murder each other for many lifetimes of men. So, while we're on the subject, let's talk about the Dark Elf pantheon of gods. If you remember from my Wood Elves video, the High Elves, Dark Elves, and Wood Elves all worship the same pantheon. For example, prayers to Khaine are common during war for all elves. A Dark Elf smith and a Wood Elf smith making weapons might both ask for Vol's blessings. The difference is, each race has their own pantheonic mandala that demonstrates which elven gods and goddesses they hold in highest esteem. First and foremost, the High Elves revere Azurian the Creator. The Wood Elves revere Kurnus and Isha, the father and mother of the elven race, and the Dark Elves worship Khaine, the bloody-handed god. The elven pantheon is split into two groups, the Kadai, who rule the heavens, and the Sithari, who rule Mirai, the elven underworld. Khaine may be the most worshipped god in Naggaroth, but he is technically not the most powerful one. Aerith Kiel, the Pale Queen, is the elf goddess of the dead, and second in power only to Azurian the Creator. It's important for me to note that elves are cursed to have their souls devoured by Slaanesh when their mortal bodies perish, just as She Who Thirsts devours the souls of Eldar in 40k. The High Elves and Wood Elves have taken precautions to guard against this fate, sealing their spirits away in waystones and elemental creatures like Treekin and Treemen Ancients. But the Dark Elves have no such defense against the Dark Prince. They are more than capable of devising one, but refuse to surrender their being to a half-life of dulled senses and diminished sensations. The knowledge that oblivion awaits them spurs them on to a wilder and more callous existence, for they believe life without limitations is their only compensation. However, this is not to say that all Dark Elf souls meet their end as nectar for thirsting Slaanesh. A few are delivered by the intercession of other gods, like Aerith Kiel, the Pale Queen, who is always eager to acquire more elves to slave for her in the underworld. Other damned souls are rescued by Loak, the Trickster. Such interventions are rare, but frequent enough to kindle some hope of salvation. So both Slaanesh and the Pale Queen compete for the souls of dead elves, which really sucks if you're an elf, because you really don't want to be falling in either one of their clutches. It's essentially eternal torment no matter how you look at it, which kind of makes the whole Dark Elf story really tragic in a way. They live thousands of years, knowing they're ultimately doomed and will have their soul tortured for all of eternity, so they try to make up for it with sex, with drugs, and rock and roll in life, but in so doing, give power to the very beings that wish to cause them suffering. It's a really weird, twisted cycle, but it's a very common one in Warhammer. Speaking of Slaanesh, we also need to talk about retcons and the Cult of Pleasure. As I said earlier, in previous editions, the Cult of Slaanesh was directly tied to the Cult of Pleasure. Morathi was a Slaaneshi cultist who was implied to have an incestuous relationship with Malekith, because that's apparently what Dark Elves do, but this wasn't just common with mommy and son. In the Darkblade series, Malus has sex with one sister and sexual thoughts about another sister, and even takes part in a Slaaneshi orgy during one of his many schemes. The Cult of Slaanesh and Cult of Khaine are in direct conflict, as worship of Slaanesh could weaken Malekith's rule, so it is the job of executioners and witch elves to root out chaotic influence wherever it breeds. In more recent editions, the incest and Cult of Pleasure were retconned out of the story to be in line with worship of the goddess Authority, Lady of Desire. She is one of the most important Dark Elf deities in the recent fluff, because when the Druchii aren't slaving, or plotting, or murdering, they're having sex, doing drugs, or feasting. All the same things Slaanesh loves, just less penis boobs and testicle tongues. Here's an interesting quote, though, from Gav Thorpe, which explains why the Slaaneshi worship was retconned out of Dark Elf lore. So here's the beginning of the quote. The subject of Slaanesh first came up when we were looking at the High Elves background and the Cult of Slaanesh. I had a long conversation with my colleagues who expressed concerns that the worship of Slaanesh was not consistent with the rest of the Dark Elf approach to the gods. In a nutshell, and without getting too metaphysical, it posed the question of why Dark Elves worship Slaanesh and at the same time also worship Khaine, but not Khorne. There's a never-ending debate about whether the gods preceded by the Warhammer races are part of or separate from the Chaos gods, and this was encapsulated in the Khaine-Khorne dichotomy. It seemed a far more plausible and characterful solution that while the elves descended into debauchery and excess, they would do so via their own pantheon of gods, just as Anarion was a disciple of Khaine and not Khorne. This gave me the opportunity to explore the religious side of the elves with more vigor, in particular, expanding upon the classical Greek, Roman approach to worship that the elves' beliefs are based on. The idea that there are darker gods in the pantheon that all elves accept, he's referencing the Sith right here, but only the Dark Elves pray to and give sacrifice to, was a nice way to lead into the idea of the Dark Elves. This is something that is further explored in the novel Malekith. End quote. So, just as hedonism and excess are encouraged in the Cults of Pleasure, sexual violence and torture are also important components of Dark Elf society and military, used as psychological weapons in warfare and on the home front against political rivals. Both are pretty common in the Malus Darkblade series of novels. The sexual violence side of things I've talked about in my sex, sexuality, and its importance in Warhammer Fantasy video that I uploaded a couple of months ago, so I won't cover it much here, although it is indeed an important aspect of Dark Elf and Slaaneshi culture. But the use of torture and extreme sadism are even more pervasive in Druchii culture. Here are a few excerpts from Bloodstorm to demonstrate the point. I will not kill you, I will hurt you. You will suffer agonies for days on end until you beg me for release. Yet I will do everything in my power to help you cling to life, each and every day. I will salve your exposed nerves and lave your raw flesh and turn a deaf ear to your pleas for mercy. If you die, it will be because you wish it. You can chew off your own tongue and choke on your blood, or simply will your heart to stop beating. I have seen it happen to far stronger Druchii than yourself. No, I will not kill you. That is your choice to make. Much of his skin and flesh beneath is gone or carved into ruin. My master preserved most of his face and his eyes. A great many of his nerves were separated and splayed as well. Truly, I have never seen a more extensive series of excruciations. How he survived for 7 days is truly a mystery to us, and his injuries are far beyond our power to heal. End quote. So, flaying is one of the most common and obviously one of the most painful kinds of torture in all of Naggaroth. And just as the Dark Elves are in 40k, the Dark Elves have learned to keep their victims alive for far longer than they should be able to survive, just so they can feel every last slice of the knife. There is even an entire regiment of renown, Mangle's Manhide Manflayers from the Dogs of War roster, named for their love of skinning their quarry alive. Very, very pleasant. So, survival of the fittest is an apt description of day-to-day life in Naggaroth. Weakness is utterly despised, and so the Druchii seldom care for the bodies of dead peers, which are often left to rot as fodder for harpies or for the cold ones. Burial rites are uncommon and reserved for those who truly demonstrated a hard resolve in life and earned the admiration of their fellows, usually on the battlefield. Despite this, genuine friendship does exist, although such bonds are carefully concealed lest they be perceived as weakness. Patricide, matricide, fratricide, and every kind of murder you can possibly conceive of are frequent, of course. When your most important god is Khaine, Lord of Murder, it seems pretty logical, but there are tons of famous examples of this. Shadowblade, the Death Who Walks Unseen, the master of Khainite assassins at only 150 years of age, which is very young for an elf, trained under Alandir Deathshard before surpassing and killing him in brutal fashion. The Malus Darkblade Omnibus is notable for the frequency in which he and his kin try to murder each other in increasingly violent ways. You can't read more than a few pages about any Dark Elf character without them plotting to murder somebody and take their position. Indeed, that is the most common method of promotion in Dark Elf society, the murder of one's superior or rival. But just like any other society, there are laws, there are rules, and Malekith does not take kindly to the indiscriminate murder of his subordinates unless he's doing it himself. So the ways in which Druchii attempt to avoid suspicion or allay fear that death might strike at any time are actually quite ingenious and often necessary to avoid being executed themselves. The Dark Elves are schemers, through and through, and every move they make is a part of an intricate game with life or death consequences. So finally, that concludes the lore portion of the video. Now we can talk about army composition and tactics the Dark Elves use in battle. Then we'll discuss potential Legendary Lord choices, new mechanics that could come alongside the Druchii in Total War Warhammer, and finally, we will go over their entire army roster and talk about how they might translate into the trilogy. You knew what you were getting into when you clicked on this video. You knew it was going to be a long one from the start. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed what you've seen so far. So the Dark Elves, similar to the Wood Elves and High Elves, are fast and dangerous, but potentially fragile. They are more fleet of foot than the humans, and favor speed and maneuverability over heavy armor, although they do have some pretty heavily armored units. They are not quite as glass cannon as the Wood Elves, but they are not tanky by any means. Where the Dark Elves truly excel is cheap, cost-effective infantry with good leadership, who can hold the line while they whittle away elites with their Dark Shards, and monsters like the Hydra maneuver to slam into the flank or rear of an opponent. They have some good skirmisher cav, a fantastic selection of monsters and terror-causing units, and a solid front line. Basically a very versatile force. Masters of none, but able to adjust their builds to combat many different threats. Druchii infantry primarily consists of spear phalanxes and repeater crossbow regiments, which are supported by elite infantry and shock troops, such as the deadly Harganeth executioners, heavily armed Corsair raiders, the Brides of Khaine that enter battle in a drug-crazed killing frenzy, or a detachment of Malekith's personal guard, the lethal Black Guard of Naggaroth. As we covered earlier, they also have one of the finest navies in Warhammer, but it still remains to be seen whether naval combat will actually be added into Game 2 of the trilogy. Considering that Man of War Corsair currently is owned by another company, and they have their own naval game, I would expect GW and Sega to want to avoid product cannibalization, where two games under the same IP and publisher basically compete for the same market. So my bet is naval combat will remain as auto-resolve. And that's not even to mention the fact there's an obscene amount of work required to give even half of the major races in Warhammer their own functioning and unique navies. It's just a whole lot of work that I'm not sure CA is ready to take on when they still have to complete the land army rosters for all the factions in Total War Warhammer. Alongside the Druchii, we will also be getting a new lore of magic, dark magic, the Wind of Dar. This is a particularly destructive wind characterized by the big daddy of magic missiles called Doombull, a reliable vortex in the form of Arnzippel's Black Horror and Blade Wind, which literally sends out a storm of flying swords, cutting units apart and doing more damage the lower the opponent's weapon skill. Combined with Word of Pain, which dramatically lowers accuracy and weapon skill on a specific enemy unit, you can utterly decimate an elite unit with Blade Wind by hitting them with the debuff first. It will be very interesting to see if CA finds a way to modify damage to an enemy based on their current stats. Interestingly enough, the Dark Elves can also field a pretty powerful air force, not on the level of a faction like Bretonnia, but they have Black Dragons, Dark Pegasi, and Manticores on many of their hero and lord choices, which means they can compete with, or best, many other Warhammer races in the air. I do expect them to be outranged against their fellow elves. That's pretty much a given against the Azrai and the Azur, who have some of the best shooting units in Warhammer, but the Dark Shards are an armor-piercing repeater crossbow unit, which, if CA does them justice, will rip through medium to low armor troops. In terms of gameplay balance for the Dark Shards, I'd like to see them with less range, but a very quick fire rate and high DPS that's quite good at punching through armor. So Cold One Knights and Chariots will provide the traditional hammer and anvil style of gameplay that we all know and love from Total War, and even though they're gigantic raptors, funnily enough, they're not actually classified as monstrous cavalry. Still, with a very powerful stat line and the fact that they're knights that ride literal dinosaurs into battle, I expect them to be able to absolutely punish units off the charge. With that out of the way, it's time to move on to the Legendary Lord choices and how these iconic characters might be implemented in Total War Warhammer. There are two very clear choices in my opinion. Malekith, the Witch King of Naggaroth, and his mother Morathi, the Hag Sorceress of Grond. Malekith is the Witch King, a being who commands the ultimate respect of his people, and for those who don't, they pay the ultimate price. You don't cross this dude, ever, because if you do, well, let's just say there's no such thing as a quick death when you get on his bad side. He is, hands down, one of the most terrifying and powerful beings to ever walk the planet. One of those legendary lord choices that should just feel obscenely strong from the moment you begin his campaign. He's been alive for thousands of years, learning dark magic from the best dark magic caster in Warhammer Fantasy for all of that time, and he is a supremely powerful melee fighter, able to take down greater demons in the lore with ease. I don't think there's any question that he would make it into the top 5 most powerful living Warhammer characters. Everything about him, from his casting ability to his speed, his intelligence, cunning, ruthlessness, and ability to lead and inspire courage or fear, is supernatural to the extreme. He leads by example from the front, and he is of course a gigantic dickhead, but conveniently he can blame the Curse of Khaine for that. His campaign would start in Naggaroth, the oldest and largest Dark Elf city, and possibly the most malevolent place on the planet. Seraphon, his Black Dragon, would be his unique mount choice, and he will have a ton of quest battles for his unique magic items. The Destroyer is his sword, forged by his own hand. It is a symbol of the Dark Elves' determination to destroy the High Elves and all of their works. In Tabletop, Destroyer forces any enemies who are in close combat with him to reveal their magic items and gives him the potential to destroy these items. As with the Cobra Mace of Mazdamundi, I think this would translate to Total War Warhammer by giving him a percentage chance on hit to completely disable an enemy magic item or potion for the rest of the game. So say if Kolek Suneater brought the Star Crusher ability, a good hit from Malekith, say it's a 20% chance, would completely prevent Kolek from using Star Crusher for the duration of the battle. Not preventing him from attacking, of course, but preventing him from using the Star Crusher ability. Generally would not be game-changing, but could be a fun mechanic, although RNGesus always has the potential to piss people off, so we'll see. I'm not sure if that'll happen. I will say I am getting a little bit bored of all these unique and cool magic items in Tabletop, just giving additional weapon strength or armor-piercing damage in-game though. I'd like to see CA get a little bit more creative on that front, at least in multiplayer. I think the campaign effects are pretty cool, but they could still use a little bit of tweaking as well. It's not a big deal, honestly, but just a personal preference. So the Armor of Midnight will very likely give Malekith over 100 armor for his base stats and a ward save of 20%, and considering that he's a combat lord, not a pure spellcaster, he'll likely have a decent-sized HP pool as well. I expect him to be very powerful, as he should be, but also very, very expensive. The Supreme Spell Shield is very interesting. It actually damages any spellcaster who targets Malekith if he successfully dispels whatever was sent his way. Since there's no dispel mechanic in the game yet, and I don't think we'll be getting one, you could basically just hit an enemy spellcaster with a free direct damage spell anytime they try to cast a spell directly on the Witch King. So say Manfred tries to Spirit Leech the Witch King, then the Supreme Spell Shield will go off and automatically send a similar direct damage spell back at Manfred. And the Circlet of Iron, the item partially responsible for Malekith's descent into madness, is a pretty cool item. I believe it just gives him bonus die on his failed rolls to cast on tabletop, which I think would just translate to a unique arcane conduit equivalent, an ability you press just before you cast to temporarily raise your Winds of Magic pool, and so that would make Malekith a better caster than some of the other casters that are already in the game. And of course, for the other starting Legendary Lord operating out of the Dark Convent in Grond would be Morathi, the Hag Sorceress. She will almost undoubtedly be a dual caster, or at least she should be, certainly with the lore of Dark Magic, and then either the lore of Death or the lore of Shadow. One of the most utterly evil, conniving, and ruthless characters in Warhammer, and also one of its strongest mages. She has a unique Dark Pegasus named Sulafet, who has 2 powerful horns protruding from his head, with which he uses to gore potential prey, and a wealth of special rules come alongside her. Hakardi's Blessing and the first Sorceress special rule will give her a stupidly huge Winds of Magic pool to work with, probably similar to Manfred von Karstein with his magic items, because you know how much he can cast when you bring all his stuff to the table. And she also has a powerful ward save, likely 20%, and an interesting rule called Enchanting Beauty. In the tabletop, any model, friend or foe, close to Morathi must pass a leadership test or take a huge penalty to their weapon skill. This will probably translate to a bound hex like the Sword of Corone item for King Lewin, lowering weapon damage of all enemies in an AoE for 20 to 40 seconds, probably in a 40 meter radius. Heartrender and the Dark Sword are her paired magical weapons, through which her attacks are always guided directly at an opponent's heart. The Dark Sword, meanwhile, saps the strength of any enemy who draws near. These permanently lower the attacks, strength, and toughness for any monster or character who suffers unsaved wounds from her, which could further debuff enemies in game. So between her Enchanting Beauty hex and magic items, she has the potential to severely cripple the damage output of enemy characters. The problem, of course, being that even with her ward save, she will probably still be very squishy and not exactly a character you want to commit directly into melee very often. Starting with Game 2, I would love for CA to start each race off with 3 Legendary Lords, but honestly, both Hellebron and Malus Darkblade will probably make it in as DLC characters. The word iconic is thrown around a lot in this community, and often undeservedly so, but I'd argue Malus is indeed iconic. He's had 6 or more novels written about him, 2 full Omnibus packages too, and the Dark Elves would function fine without him, but it just wouldn't quite feel right if he never made it in. He has a unique Cold One mount named Spite, and is literally possessed by a demon named Zarkan, the Drinker of Worlds, courtesy of his greediness on a trip to the Chaos Wastes. The armor piercing from his Warp Sword of Khaine and unique Cold One I think would just make him a ton of fun to play, and of course there are going to be a ton of players who have read these novels that just want to recreate those stories from their childhood, so definitely expect to see Malus Darkblade at some point. Hellebron we've already covered, but she is a goddess in melee, and given that she can be mounted on a Cauldron of Blood and is an incredibly important figurehead and religious leader in the Cult of Khaine, I think her inclusion is all but guaranteed at some point. We don't know when. She just isn't more likely than Morathi, in my opinion. I do think Malekith and Morathi will be the starting Legendary Lords, and I could totally see her coming a few months after launch with a couple of Khainite units in a DLC. It'll be super obvious if any of those are missing on launch day, and then we'll know for sure whether she'll be coming soon afterwards or not. So now that we've talked about Legendary Lords, let's talk about possible gameplay mechanics that could fit the lore, and provide some unique gameplay and challenges for a Dark Elf campaign. So yeah, as we've already covered, Black Arks, Death Knight, Treachery, and Slavery are all very important components of the Dark Elves, so I think these should form the bulk of the unique Dark Elf campaign mechanics as well. War between the 6 major cities, and even some of the Black Arks, is very common. In fact, oftentimes Malekith encourages it so that the weak perish and the strong survive. So I was trying to come up with some kind of rebellion or civil war mechanic that would actually be fun, but that's kind of the problem, right? Having provinces rebel just because a Dark Elf general is disloyal or something isn't very fun. And some people think that the Realm Divide in Shogun 2 and Civil War in Rome 2 are kind of contrived mechanics and not very enjoyable. But that's certainly not everybody. There are plenty of people who really enjoy both of those because they at least stop the steamroll and provide a mid to late game challenge, and provide you with something to think about outside of pure expansion. So there are a couple late game options here for the Dark Elves to provide some kind of challenge. I think a politics and civil war mechanic like in Rome 2 Emperor Edition could definitely work, and would be very logical with the Dark Elves. So you want Malekith running with, say, 75% of the political power, but you also need to make sure that the individual cities and the ruling nobles have enough that they don't feel like they're being cut out, but not enough power to directly challenge Malekith. And if this balance of power shifts enough in one of the city's favor, then a civil war begins in whichever city has gained the most traction, triggering some Dark Elf armies to spawn, and taking the region with them. This fits the lore perfectly, as it is definitely somewhat common for Dreadlords to challenge Malekith's power, either in secret or in an outright show of force, and it's already a mechanic that's been in CA games before. But if they're going to add it to the Dark Elves campaign, they have to also add it for the Empire and the Elector counts as well. That could make their campaign so much more interesting, in my opinion. So certainly, if it happens for the Dark Elves, it needs to happen for the Empire as well. In terms of a true late game challenge, absolutely there should be warriors and demons of chaos armies attacking from the Chaos Waste to the north of Naggaroth. The Dark Elves are literally on the front line against the ruinous powers, which a lot of people don't really think about because Archaon and Kolek and all the famous invasions come from Norska. But the Chaos Wastes are huge, and they literally start right there to the north of Naggaroth, so that will definitely be a problem for them. The question is, will the Demons of Chaos be in the game when the Dark Elves launch? I personally don't think they will be. I think the Skaven will be the 4th starting race, in which case we won't be seeing demonic invasions until probably the 3rd game. So if the Demons of Chaos are a base faction in Game 2, then Slaaneshi or Khorne invasions will absolutely keep you on your toes once the late game rolls around. There's no Kislev buffer state for you. Once they spawn, your cities will immediately be under assault, which is actually pretty cool. It might be a nice late game challenge. I personally cannot wait until we see a Valkia the Bloody-led chaos invasion of Naggaroth. That will be truly incredible. I can't wait to see it. In terms of your economy, slavery is everything, but it's difficult to make sacrifices to Khaine when slaves are busy building your empire. So naval raiding stance should automatically gather slaves when they're near the coastline of enemy provinces, and gathering these slaves should give big bonuses to your rate of building and the money you get out of your cities. There could be a Cult of Khaine mechanic that you kind of have to balance with it though, where you gain favor with the cult through executing captives after a battle, which in turn would give you better Witch Elves and Khainite units, strengthening your people when sacrifice is high enough to sate the Lord of Murder. But remember that you gain economic and building bonuses by enslaving them post-battle and sending them back to Khar and Khar. So this would encourage you to keep raiding, fighting, and expanding, because with a shortage of slaves and sacrifice, people are going to get unhappy. But you'd have a choice to make there, right? Do I want to buff my economy, or do I want to improve public order and please the Cult of Khaine? Now, making sacrifices to Khaine would also play a huge role in Death Knight, which would function similarly to the Morslib events. You get huge bonuses on Death Knight as long as you have a lot of captured slaves. Your armies get replenishment buffs as soldiers filled with bloodlust fill your ranks, and your Witch Elves and Khainite recruits get tons of experience. But if you don't have enough slaves when Death Knight rolls around every 10 to 15 turns or so, or whatever it is, your armies will take attrition, and you won't get the buffs, demonstrating the Cult of Khaine's displeasure with you, and the fact that the Witch Elves are still going to reap souls that night. So if there aren't any slaves to kill, they'll be killing your soldiers instead, which is very accurate to the lore as well. Nobles and soldiers died to the Cult of Khaine all the time. And finally, the Black Arks are mobile bases, which should absolutely play a huge role in your Dark Elf campaign. They are floating fortresses that can sail the sea and provide you with raiding parties and naval power abroad. These arcs should be able to garrison navies and armies, replenishing them, and serve as a mobile invasion platform anywhere in the world that has a coastline. Remember that they are essentially cities, so it would be incredible if you could recruit some naval-themed troops there, like Black Ark Corsairs, the Charybdis, and maybe some basic stuff like Dread Spears and Bleak Swords as well, because this would allow you to literally start an army from scratch on the sea and begin invading anywhere you want. This has the potential to be the most unique gameplay mechanic yet, one in which you can literally make armies on the fly anywhere in the world. If you want to siege Barak Var, the Dwarf Port, send a Black Ark, build an army on the open sea, and raze it to the ground. That would be so much fun, and it would really give them some really unique flavor, and definitely make a huge impact on your campaigns as well. I do expect Black Arks to be battle maps, and although I'm not quite as excited to fight on those as I am to fight in a Lizardmen Temple City, there is no question fighting a huge battle on top of a Black Ark will be a truly unique and memorable experience. Again, I don't think it will be a naval battle per se though. I think it would basically be the equivalent of a siege battle, because Black Arks are so big, they would take up most of a naval map anyway, and not give enough room for normal fleets to go around. And it would just be weird to see a high elf ship blow up something as big as a Black Ark, even though, yes, in the lore, dragon ships are able to do it. I think if some or most of these ideas get implemented, it will be a very unique and fun campaign experience that accurately reflects the lore, but let me know what you guys think. Can you think of any other ideas that might be fun to implement in the Dark Elves campaign? Definitely let me know in the comment section below. But with all of that out of the way, let's move on to the Dark Elves army and units, who have some of the most hilariously edgy naming conventions in all of Warhammer, but without question, some of the most terrifying monsters and core troops as well. For your Lord characters, you're going to have the choice between Dreadlords and Supreme Sorceress. Dreadlords are the noble-born rulers of Naggaroth, the generals, the governors, and the ones who plot and scheme to control the major cities, or even supplant the Witch King himself. Honed by centuries of war and assassination attempts, they are the melee-focused lords of the Drugii, with a very nice selection of mounts to choose from. You can plop them on a Dark Steed, a Cold One, a Dark Pegasus, Manticore, Chariot, or even a Black Dragon, which I'm hoping will receive some revamps by the time Game 2 comes out. Because Game 2, with the Dark Elves and High Elves especially, is when we will be getting the most dragon-focused game. Dragons are supposed to be utterly terrifying, the greatest monsters in the lore. Right now they're okay because they're flying and they cause terror, but they lose badly to Griffins and Lewin's Hippogriff, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, and they get chunked by even weaker troops, as in they don't sustain in melee combat very well. They should be the clear centerpiece of an army when you choose to bring one. They should get significantly more armor and HP and not be a detriment to your Lord stats, which in some cases they do reduce your Lord stats, which doesn't make much sense either, but they should cost an obscene amount of money to field. Right now, it's often a much better idea to just bring a Pegasus because it's cheaper, gives you way more mobility, and it doesn't hurt your Lord stats in any area to field one. But all flyers need to have a significantly lower charge bonus so that the whole dive bombing cycle charge meta is discouraged. A dragon shouldn't be cycle charging. You should be able to commit it into the center of an enemy formation and expect it to do well against most units in sustained combat. They are known for their durability and their ability to dish out damage, and right now, I don't think they do either particularly well. What they do really well is landing in combat and causing things to run away because of terror. But they need more sustain to be where dragons are supposed to be, in my opinion. The Supreme Sorceress is your other lord choice, probably starting with Shadows, Death, and Dark Magic as her 3 lords to choose from. It still remains to be seen whether the Lizardmen or Elves will end up getting all 8 standard Lords of Magic, but I really hope they do. It will be pretty disgusting to see the Empire with all 8 lores and the Elves and Slann with much less variety to choose from, when in the lore, they are far better casters across the board than humans are. We shall see on that front. Now, one thing I haven't covered from the lore yet, which I should do here, is talk quickly about the Prophecy of Demise. You may be wondering why only Dark Elf ladies appear to be magically adept. Well, this Prophecy of Demise was gifted to Calidor when Anarion drew the Widowmaker, and it stated that the Dark King would fall, slain by neither blade nor arrow, but by a sorcerer's power of darkest magic, and so would his body be consumed in the flames for all eternity to burn. Obviously, Malekith thought this prophecy was about him, so he banned all other males from learning magic or being committed to the convent. There are those in Naggaroth who are male, who still practice magic, but they generally do it in secret and far away from Malekith. So these ladies can be fielded on a Dark Steed, a Cold One, Dark Pegasus, Manticore, or a Black Dragon. And I think it's pretty cool they can be mounted on a Black Dragon, because if dragons get reworked, it will let her punch well above her weight class. The High Beastmaster is a slave driver and animal master who can turn Hydras, Charybdis, and other creatures into weapons of war. They focus on buffing these creatures, so if you want to build a Hydra core, for example, this guy might be your lord of choice. They can be mounted on a Manticore or a Scourge Runner Chariot. Now, Scourge Runner Chariots are really cool, They're lightning quick and fire a Ravager harpoon that can literally drag monsters towards them in the tabletop and lore, doing damage over time. It's basically a moving bolt thrower on a chariot, so in reality, in Total War, it will probably just have a bonus versus large and possibly debuff enemy movement speed when they're hit by the projectile. For heroes, the Death Hag is a higher up in the Cult of Khaine, focusing on buffing surrounding units, but also with some pretty potent close combat potential as well. Very low armor, but high weapon skill, poison attacks, and frenzy, so she can be mounted on a Cauldron of Blood, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and take 3 separate upgrades on that, which might end up being like the 3 different kinds of Mortis engines for the vampire counts. The Cry of War would give off a fear aura in a significant area of effect, probably 40 meter radius. The Rune of Khaine would buff melee attack for all nearby units, and Witch Brew would give all nearby units frenzy, so pretty effing good. The Khainite Assassin is a hero and lord killer, with an absurd ballistic and weapon skill of 9, meaning in close quarters and from range, he hurts real bad against single entities. He should have stalk, fire while hidden, and be that sneaky guy who snipes lords or casters when your opponent is focusing their micro elsewhere. If a Khainite Assassin gets bogged down in melee by a unit, they're low armor and the duelist trait is going to severely hurt them though, so not exactly a frontline kind of combat hero. And now onto the core choices, where the edgy naming conventions really kick in. The Dread Spears, Bleak Swords, and Dark Shards. Oh no, so angsty. But for real, they are a very solid core across the board. Dread Spears and Bleak Swords are spear and sword variants with solid stats, a shield block chance, decent armor, and good movement speed. Relatively cheap, cost-efficient force across the board that can hold the main line very well. Dark Shards are the repeater crossbow unit with good armor piercing, possibly shorter range than other bows in Total War, but a faster fire rate that can tear through medium to low armored units very quickly once they get into range. Black Ark Corsairs are Reavers and naval combatants, the ones we will most often see fighting from the floating fortresses. They can either dual wield hand weapons, giving them higher melee attack and weapon skill, or you can wield a variant with an offhand bow, which would function much like the Free Company Militia currently for the Empire. Unlike Free Company Militia though, the Corsairs are pretty durable and can go straight into melee and work as your frontline units, so melee combat is absolutely an option for them. Witch Elves, the Brides of Khaine, are super cool, definitely one of my most anticipated units, simply because of their versatility and melee prowess. Frenzy, poison attacks, high movement speed, and cheap to field, they're great flankers and just have a ton of utility. Pretty similar to the playstyle of Forsaken, I would think, but instead of getting 70 armor, they'll have a much lower armor value and gain poison in return. It's going to be incredibly satisfying to roll with these as your core with a Cauldron of Blood and a Death Hag on top of that. An entire army of half-naked, screaming ladies moving super fast and wanting nothing more than to sacrifice you and your family to their beloved patron. Will be even more fun once we get Crone Hellebron. Witch Elf Army in multiplayer will be one of my first videos once the Dark Elves drop. And for our last core troop, the Dark Riders are another very versatile unit with crossbows and shields. Mounted on very fast horses, they can harass enemy cavalry or slaughter enemy range units with a good charge, and once they're out of ammo, you can also commit them into melee and still expect them to do okay. They're a little bit squishy, but like I said, they are very versatile, have a lot of different uses, and they can also Vanguard deploy, so the potential to deploy them behind enemy lines is definitely there, and if CA works on the wonky deployment zones that cover the entire half of a lot of these battlefields, that will make them even more viable, getting a Vanguard deploying cavalry unit that can deploy behind an enemy line and quickly get into their artillery or their range units once the battle starts. And now on to special units. Shades are scouts from the Black Spine Mountains to the north of Clark-Arand, who now live in the wilderness in a culture just as bloodthirsty, if not more so, but utterly different from the nobles of the cities. They are one with their environment, very similar to the Wood Elves of Athelorn in some ways, and can move unseen through any environment they adapt to. They can fire repeater crossbows on the move, which is a pretty awesome thing about them, and will probably have stalk and Vanguard deployment as well. If CA is feeling really generous, they might even give them fire while hidden, which with their shorter range, if repeater crossbows are implemented the way I expect, might even be necessary to make them viable as a skirmish troop. Harpies are, well, they already exist for the Beastmen, and they serve the same purpose here. high mobility, flying, but tiny armor value, really only super useful if you're going for air superiority and need a unit that can soak up the charge of an enemy flyer like King Lewin and swarm him while your Black Dragon rips him up. That can be very good in aerial combat, but in terms of a unit that's going to do a lot of damage, probably not so much, and they're going to get shredded by High Elf archers as well. These brutal edgelords are the Hargoneth Executioners. I've heard people say they don't like the skull masks or the new outfit they got in 8th edition, saying older versions of the Executioners, and actually indeed the entire aesthetic of the race used to be better in 6th or 7th. But I personally disagree, at least in this instance. I think these skull masks, well, I know these skull masks are not new. They were written as a description for the Executioners in the Malus Darkblade series of novels as far back as 2005. They were described as having these very same skull masks, and I think their aesthetic is pretty terrifying and awesome. It's obviously very overt and very in your face, which is what Warhammer is all about anyway. And I still like the old designs, but I still think these ones are really cool looking, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing them in Total War Warhammer 2. The two-handed Drake, or Drake they carry, looks super intimidating, and they'll function like great swords do already. They're armor-piercing, bonus versus infantry, heavily armored killing machines. Interestingly enough, they are actually some of the least sadistic archetypes in all of Naggaroth. They don't play with their victims or delight in their suffering in the same way some of the other Dark Elves do. They see their role more as a religious duty, and a very bloody one that results in the decapitation of those they sacrifice after battle. But they don't play with them, like cut their arms off and watch and laugh, which is what a lot of other Drukgyai do. And now we're on to Cold One Knights, and now we are seriously getting somewhere. One of my most anticipated units in Game 2, Cold One Knights are heavily armored cavalrymen on huge raptors who can eviscerate enemy cavalry or infantry on the charge. They will be one of the most heavily armored cav units in Warhammer, simply because of their thick-skinned special rule, which demonstrates the survivability and tankiness of a Noglier when compared to a regular horse. Also cause fear, as you would expect when confronted with a dinosaur that can literally fit your entire body in its jaws. I'm still curious how CA is going to implement the stupidity rule, or if they're even going to implement it. I don't know if there are any units currently in Total War Warhammer 1 that are stupid, but because it's kind of a funky rule that doesn't really translate so well from the tabletop to a Total War Warhammer game. So we'll see if CA decides to add a special rule for them, but in terms of armor and killing prowess, these guys are going to be top notch. Really looking forward to them. Cold One Chariots, much the same, although in Dark Elf culture, owning one of these chariots is a symbol of great prestige, even greater than owning a single Noglier. They will tear through infantry formations and skirmishers in seconds, but how chariots function in Total War Warhammer 1 is how they're going to function going forward. They will get bogged down very easily when confronted with higher mass units like cavalry or monsters. You do not want your chariot to stop moving, because the second it stops moving is the second it starts dying, and they will die very quickly, even with a bunch of gigantic raptors strapped at the front of them. The Black Guard of Naggaroth are one of those units you've seen many times in my Call of Warhammer beginning of the End Times videos. They only answer to the call of the Witch King Malekith and are his most elite bodyguards. Deadly, incredibly skilled warriors with halberds who are immune to psychology, so they can't get feared or terrified. The problem is, halberds are currently in kind of a weird state in this trilogy. I believe they have among the slowest base attack times in the game, so they perform pretty poorly versus enemy infantry units. There are two halberd units coming up, the Black Guard of Naggaroth for the Dark Elves, and the Phoenix Guard of Azurian for the High Elves, who are supposed to be among the best infantry units in all of Warhammer. In fact, I believe both the Black Guard and the Phoenix Guard, certainly the Phoenix Guard, I'm not so much sure about the Black Guard, are considered among the best infantry units in all of Warhammer. As in, I think the Phoenix Guard were maybe the best unit, period, in terms of infantry. But if halberds stay the same, even though they're armor-piercing, they're going to need a serious stat increase to be viable with that really slow base attack time, because that really hurts units like the Chaos Warriors with halberds and Empire Halberdiers, which are already in the game. Now, obviously, those two units are a tier below Black Guard and Phoenix Guard, but I'm curious if CA will mess with the BAT of either unit to make them more effective in sustained melee, or just give them insane stats to compensate. You can rest assured, though, they will both be armor-piercing and bonus versus large, and they should be slaughtering stuff in melee, whether it's large or whether it's infantry. The Reaper Bolt Thrower is a siege weapon that can shoot the crap out of stuff, as you would expect. They can fire either as a single bolt or a hail of barb bolts, which cause horrendous injuries in those they don't outright kill, armor piercing, and will probably function very, very similarly to the Bolt Thrower that we already have for the dwarves. Now, the War Hydra is without a doubt the most iconic Dark Elf monster, one that has earned its reputation on the tabletop and in the lore. These things are terrifying. Literally, they cause terror, they can breathe fire, and should have insane stats representing their overall survivability and their melee prowess. Just like in Greek mythology, if one head is severed, it will grow back very quickly, so the only way to kill it in the lore is by taking them all in quick succession. Now, of course, they won't function this way in-game, but they will very likely be the core go-to monster for the Dark Elves, slamming into the flanks of enemy units and ripping them apart. I'm hoping that breath weapons are reworked by the time Dark Elves come into the game, because this will also benefit the dragons. Like I said, Hydras and dragons are going to play a big role in Total War Warhammer 2, and so what I would like to see from the breath spells is not be this innate kind of attack animation that doesn't seem to really do anything. I want it to be an actual breath spell that you can activate that you aim. So if I put a dragon on the flank of an enemy unit, you can see the AoE that the flames that's about to shoot out, like where that attack will go, and I can decide to use it on the flank or use it in certain situations and make it a skill shot, which would make it a lot more entertaining, a lot more exciting in game, and give us an active ability to use rather than just a kind of cool looking attack animation that's already in there for the dragons and for the Hydras. And now we are on to rare choices, where the Dark Elves have some really cool options. So the Doomfire Warlocks were the first male sorcerers wrecked by Malekith after he found out about the Prophecy of Demise, and he cursed them for all time, so that when they die, their souls would be snuffed out and consumed by Slaanesh in a process that cannot be averted. However, they can delay their fate by sacrificing others in their stead, slowing the unholy curse that burns beneath their skin. They are magical cavalry, similar to the Sisters of the Thorn in the Wood Elves Army book, but instead specialize in offensive maneuvers. They have 2 bound spells, so unlike the Curse of Anrahir and the Shield of Thorns the Sisters of the Thorn get, they get Doombolt, the powerful magic missile from the lore of dark magic, and Soul Blight from the lore of death. They also do poison damage and have very fast horses. Interestingly enough, they are also weak to Slaaneshi units, representing the hold the Dark Prince holds over them, so they might get a debuff when fighting any unit with the mark of Slaanesh like they do in the tabletop. Sisters of Slaughter are gladiatresses who pledge their lives to Eldrazor, Lord of Blades. In the lore, they are experts at tearing apart enemy formations, the deeper the better, because they have a special technique where they jump over the front rank of shields and wreck everybody around them with their bladed whips. In tabletop, this is represented by them negating the rank bonus of whichever unit they're in base contact with, but I have literally no idea how that will be translated into Total War Warhammer, because you don't get bonuses for deeper formations in Total War. They're lowly armored, high attack troops who look absolutely badass, really awesome models on them, but we'll see if CA can give us a reason to use them over the Brides of Khaine. And this badass is the Charybdis, a cross between a Kraken and a Hydra, a deep sea monster that is the ultimate coveted possession of the Beastmasters of Clark Harrond. They are known for rampaging through entire enemy formations, ripping them apart and swallowing them whole, digesting armor and bone in seconds. However, enchanted artifacts and gemstones seem to be resistant to their digestive system, so they are often filled with precious materials that are only found once the beast is eventually cut down. This thing causes terror on steroids, with a special rule called Abyssal Howl that will severely deplete enemy morale and then kick terror into high gear. So expect them to have maybe an innate -8 morale penalty or something like that, when combined with terror that will cause units to flee all over the field as soon as they enter melee with them. If you have low leadership against a Charybdis, you are going to cry. So Greenskins and Chaos Warriors for now need to beware, because at the moment they are very susceptible to terror-causing units. The Cauldron of Blood is the centerpiece of the Khainite units, a terror-causing chariot that is not drawn by beasts of war, but the will of Khaine himself. They have a ward save and function like the Grail Reliquae, can be mounted by Hellebrand or Death Hags, and will either have a bound spell that gives a specific unit frenzy, or will have a passive area of effect ability that grants all nearby units with frenzy. It will also dramatically enhance the combat prowess of Witch Elf units and Hargoneth Executioners, although this may turn into another flat buff for all nearby units. Really cool centerpiece unit for Khaine. And this is a Bloodrack Medusa. These were the sorceresses of Grond who used their magics to become even more beautiful than the gods, and in so doing, they drew the gaze of Atharti, which was a really bad idea, because she doesn't like it when mortals are sexier than she is, so she cursed them, turning them into ugly, serpent-like beasts, and ravaged their minds as well. She left a tiny sliver of awareness in her victims, so they might remember their old forms, and so they could look in the mirror and be tormented by everything they had lost. Now, they serve Morathi, as magical beings who will literally rip the life essence and blood from an enemy's body if they lock eyes with them for an instant. They cause terror, as you would expect, and mounted upon a Bloodrack shrine, they buff the morale of all nearby units, because apparently, Dark Elves love to hear the echo of Adusa's endless torment, because they're sadistic dicks. And they also debuff enemy morale on top of that in an AoE. So, combined with terror, and the fact that they have a leadership debuff, they're just like the Charybdis in that way. They're going to be a nice... Well, they buff troops, which the Charybdis doesn't, but the fact that they can stack terror and a leadership debuff is really, really strong. If enemies are in contact with them, they will probably take damage over time to demonstrate the Avert Your Gaze special rule, and the Dusa, when not mounted on the shrine, can fire a bound magic missile called Bloodrack Stare. I don't think that magic missile will have any super special properties, but it will be a bound spell, so it won't cost any winds of magic to use. And that, my friends, is the lore and army roster of the Dark Elves, how I think they should be implemented in Total War Warhammer, the unique mechanics introduced alongside the faction, and the units and lords we can expect. It took a long-ass time to make, but it was a labor of love, and huge props to those of you who managed to make it through the whole thing. I love sharing these rich backstories and unit descriptions with you all. I think it's always an interesting discussion to be able to sit down and talk about how Warhammer lore and tabletop gameplay might make it into the Total War Warhammer trilogy, which more and more people will be getting into and hyped about again as we gear up for the announcement video on the 31st of March for Total War Warhammer 2, which will presumably have the Dark Elves of Naggaroth as a headlining race alongside the High Elves, Lizardmen, and either the Skaven or the Demons of Chaos, I think will be the fourth faction. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a comment and a like. It really helps the channel grow, and this video took an obscenely long amount of time to put together. I tried to bring out as many sources together to make this my most detailed lore, army, and tactics video yet. I will of course continue to make these kind of lore videos, but if you really enjoy them, please feel free to consider donating to my Patreon account. Making a living off YouTube ad revenue is working for now, but ad money in general is a very fickle thing, and every little bit helps. So if you really enjoy my content, please consider that option. Link will be in the description, but if you can't or don't want to, it is not a problem at all. You can support me and my videos just by showing up and watching them. Thank you all for the support. I really, really appreciate it, and I sincerely hope you enjoyed the video as well. See you next time. Indypride, signing out for now.